Picture the Sahara Desert today, an endless sea of sand stretching as far as the eye can see, where temperatures soar, water is almost nowhere to be found, and survival seems nearly impossible. This vast, unforgiving landscape is one of the most extreme environments on Earth, a place where even modern explorers tread carefully. But now, let your mind travel back in time, more than 5,000 years ago, to the banks of the Nile River. Here, something extraordinary was taking root, a civilization that would not only endure in the face of such brutal conditions, but would flourish, creating one of the most magnificent and enduring cultures in human history. How did the ancient Egyptians achieve this incredible feat? How did they transform a land flanked by desert into a cradle of civilization, rich with art, architecture, and innovation that still captivates us today? This is the mystery we are about to explore together, a journey into the heart of ancient Egypt's greatest survival story. Far from simply enduring their environment, the Egyptians mastered it, developing ingenious methods to harness the Nile's gifts, outsmart the desert's challenges, and build a society that stood the test of millennia. Their story is not just one of adaptation, but of profound resilience and visionary innovation, qualities that echo across time and invite us to rethink what humans can achieve even under the most daunting circumstances. This was a people who looked at a landscape of scarcity and saw abundance, who turned isolation into opportunity, and who crafted a legacy so powerful it continues to inspire wonder and curiosity thousands of years later. In this video, we'll uncover the secrets behind their survival, from revolutionary irrigation techniques that turned desert edges into fertile fields, to clever architectural designs that kept homes cool under the blazing sun. We'll explore how they stored food and water for long dry seasons, how they organized their society to maximize cooperation, and how their spiritual beliefs fueled their determination to thrive against all odds. This is more than a history lesson. It's an invitation to walk alongside the ancient Egyptians, to witness their struggles and triumphs, and to discover how their innovations still resonate in our understanding of sustainability and human potential. So settle in, and let's begin this journey into one of humanity's most captivating tales of resilience and ingenuity. At the very heart of this survival story lies one incredible, life-giving force, the Nile River. To truly grasp the scale of its importance, we need to understand that for the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was far more than just a river. It was the very pulse of their existence, a sacred source of sustenance, and the ultimate reason their civilization could not only take root but thrive in such a harsh environment. Every aspect of their lives, from the food they ate to the gods they worshipped, was intimately tied to its flow. This immense waterway carved a narrow, vibrant ribbon of green through the vast sun-bleached desert, creating a stark and powerful contrast that defined their entire world. They called this fertile strip along the riverbanks Kemet, which translates to the Black Land. This name came from the deep, dark, nutrient-rich silt that the Nile deposited during its annual flood. This wasn't just ordinary mud. It was a miraculous, self-renewing fertilizer that kept their farmlands incredibly productive year after year, century after century. Surrounding this narrow band of life was the desert, the Red Land, the fierce, burning, and deadly desert that represented chaos, danger, and the unknown. The Egyptians saw themselves as the people of the Black Land, living a life of order and abundance that was protected and defined by the Nile, standing in direct opposition to the chaos of the Red Land that constantly pressed in on them from both sides. This entire cycle of life was governed by the river's predictable annual inundation, an event so reliable it became the foundation of their calendar. Unlike the unpredictable and often destructive floods of other rivers, the Nile's flood was a welcomed, anticipated event. Each year, around July, the river would begin to swell, fed by heavy summer rains far to the south in the highlands of Ethiopia. By late autumn, the floodwaters would slowly recede, leaving behind that precious layer of black silt, perfectly hydrating the soil and preparing the fields for planting. This created 3 distinct seasons in their year: Akhet, the season of inundation when the land was underwater; Peret, the season of emergence when the waters receded and farmers sowed their seeds in the moist, fertile earth; and Shemu, the season of harvest, when the crops were gathered under the hot, dry sun. Their entire society, from the lowliest farmer to the pharaoh himself, organized their work and rituals around this dependable, life-giving rhythm. Naturally, an event of such profound importance was seen as nothing less than divine. The Egyptians believed the inundation was the work of the god Hapi, a deity often depicted as a robust, androgynous figure with large breasts and a belly, symbolizing fertility and abundance. Hapi was the spirit of the Nile itself, and it was he who was credited with bringing the fertile silt and life-giving waters from the mysterious caverns of the underworld where the river was thought to originate. During the flood season, priests would make offerings to Hapi, and hymns were sung in his honor, pleading for a bountiful, but not too destructive, inundation. This divine interpretation wasn't just superstition, it was a fundamental part of their worldview, a way of explaining and giving thanks for the natural miracle that allowed them to survive. The Nile's gift was so central that it shaped their identity, their economy, their religion, and their very understanding of the universe, proving that their greatest lifeline was a harmonious blend of geography and profound belief. Yet simply waiting for the flood was not enough. To truly harness the Nile's power, the ancient Egyptians had to become masters of hydraulic engineering. Their most transformative innovation was the development of a remarkably efficient system known as basin irrigation. This was not a haphazard process, but a brilliantly organized, large-scale operation that transformed the entire floodplain into a vast, productive engine. The entire agricultural cycle depended on this human-made landscape of canals and basins, a testament to their deep understanding of their environment and their ability to shape it to their will. The process began well before the floodwaters arrived. Communities would work together to construct a complex network of large trapezoidal earthen banks, building them up from the heavy Nile silt itself. These banks, sometimes reinforced with woven reeds and stones, crisscrossed the flatlands adjacent to the river, creating a series of massive, contained pools or basins. The scale of this effort was immense, requiring enormous cooperation and centralized planning. The entire system functioned like a carefully designed mosaic, with each individual basin acting as a single cell that could be managed independently, yet all were interconnected to serve the whole. When the Nile began its majestic rise, the real work commenced. A main canal, often dug at a slight angle to the river's flow, would direct the churning, silt-laden water into this waiting network of basins. Strategically placed sluice gates, simple yet effective barriers made of wood or stone, allowed farmers to control the flow, filling one basin at a time until the water reached the desired depth. This was a delicate balancing act. They needed to trap enough water to thoroughly saturate the soil and deposit the precious silt, but not so much that it would drown the land for too long or breach the walls. The water would be held captive in these pools for several weeks, allowing the suspended silt particles to gently settle out, blanketing the entire basin in that life-giving black earth. As the Nile's waters receded, the sluice gates were opened to drain any excess water back into the river, leaving behind a perfectly prepared field, deeply moistened, fabulously fertile, and ready for sowing. Farmers would then simply scatter their seeds, emmer wheat, barley, flax, across the soft, mud-caked ground. They often followed this by driving herds of sheep or pigs across the fields to trample the seeds into the perfect depth, a natural and effortless form of plowing. The retained moisture in the soil was sufficient to nourish the crops to maturity through the long, rainless growing season. This entire system maximized agricultural yield with a stunning economy of effort, turning the annual flood from a passive event into an active, managed resource that sustained a civilization. With their fields perfectly prepared by the receding floodwaters, the ancient Egyptians faced a critical decision: what to plant in this brief, fertile window. Their choices were not a matter of random preference, but the result of millennia of careful observation and adaptation. They cultivated a remarkably limited yet powerful set of staple crops, each one meticulously selected for its ability to thrive in the unique conditions of the Nile Valley, its nutritional value, and its versatility in their daily lives. This wasn't just farming, it was a strategic partnership with their environment, maximizing every inch of the precious black land. The undisputed kings of the Egyptian field were emmer wheat and barley. These two grains formed the absolute foundation of the ancient Egyptian diet, providing the vast majority of calories for the entire population, from the pharaoh to the humblest laborer. Emmer wheat, an ancient predecessor to modern wheat, was prized for its hardiness and was the primary ingredient for baking bread. It was a challenging grain to process. Its hulls, or glooms, were tough and needed to be carefully parched and pounded to free the edible kernels, but the effort was well worth it. The resulting flour was mixed into dough, which was then fermented and baked into dozens of different bread varieties, from simple flatbreads cooked on hearthstones to elaborate shaped loaves baked in conical clay ovens. Bread was so fundamental that the Egyptian word for it, ta, was also synonymous with food and life itself. Barley, slightly more tolerant of saline soil than emmer, was its crucial counterpart. While also used for bread, barley's most famous destiny was to be transformed into beer, or heck. This thick, nutritious, slightly alcoholic beverage was a dietary staple consumed by men, women, and even children on a daily basis. It was less a recreational drink and more a vital source of calories, vitamins, and hydration, especially important in a climate where water sources could sometimes be questionable. The brewing process was a household art, often led by women. It involved baking a barley bread, partially fermenting it to create a mash, and then straining the liquid into jars where it would ferment further. This Egyptian beer was likely cloudy, sweet, and nutritious, a far cry from modern brews, but an essential fuel for the civilization that built the pyramids. Beyond these caloric powerhouses, the Egyptians skillfully integrated another vital crop, flax. This unassuming plant was the source of linen, the fabric that clothed an entire nation. The process was incredibly labor-intensive, from harvesting the flax stalks to retting, beating, and spinning them into fine, strong thread. Weavers then worked this thread into everything from the coarse linen worn by farmers to the almost transparent, delicately pleated garments reserved for royalty and high priests. Linen was more than just practical, it was deeply symbolic. Its light color and breathable quality were ideal for the hot climate, and its cleanliness was associated with ritual purity and the divine. A person's social status could be immediately read in the quality and fineness of their linen. To complete their diet and add crucial vitamins and flavor, Egyptian farmers also maintained diverse kitchen gardens, cultivating a suite of reliable vegetables. Onions, leeks, and garlic were ubiquitous, providing not only strong flavors to liven up a grain-heavy diet, but also valued for their perceived medicinal properties. Lentils, beans, chickpeas, and radishes added protein and variety, while cucumbers, melons, and lettuce rounded out their meals. This carefully curated selection of crops reveals a profound understanding of sustainable agriculture. Each plant was chosen because it grew well in the sun-baked, silt-rich soil, had a growing season that aligned perfectly with the Nile's rhythm, and provided a specific essential need, whether calories, clothing, or nutrition. They didn't fight their environment to grow exotic luxuries. They mastered the art of cultivating what would naturally thrive, turning their agricultural system into a model of breathtaking efficiency and resilience. But while the Nile provided the means for life, the surrounding deserts, those vast and intimidating seas of sand, were far from empty wastelands. The ancient Egyptians possessed a remarkably sophisticated understanding of their entire environment, and they came to see the desert not merely as a barrier to be feared, but as a tremendous resource to be mastered. This shift in perspective was crucial. It transformed a symbol of chaos and death into a land of immense opportunity, providing the very materials that would allow their civilization to achieve unparalleled grandeur and power. Where others might have seen only desolation, Egyptian prospectors, quarrymen, and soldiers saw a treasure chest waiting to be unlocked. One of the most powerful draws into the eastern desert and the mountains of the Sinai Peninsula was the relentless pursuit of precious minerals. The most coveted of all was gold, a metal the Egyptians believed was the flesh of the gods themselves, imperishable and radiant like the sun. Major mining expeditions, often sponsored by the pharaoh himself, would venture into these arid, rugged regions. They would establish temporary settlements near veins of quartzite, where flecks of gold were painstakingly pounded free from the hard rock using heavy stone mauls. This was brutally difficult work under the scorching sun, but it supplied the vast quantities of gold that adorned temples, filled royal tombs with splendorous objects, and were used as diplomatic gifts to project Egypt's immense wealth and power to foreign empires. Alongside gold, they sought the brilliant blue-green turquoise of the Sinai, highly prized for exquisite jewelry and inlay work, and copper, essential for crafting the tools that built their monuments and the weapons that equipped their armies. Perhaps the most visible legacy of their desert resourcefulness is literally set in stone, the very fabric of their most iconic monuments. The cliffs bordering the Nile Valley were not barren, they were immense quarries holding building materials of phenomenal quality and scale. Just across the river from their capital at Memphis, the limestone plateaus of Chura provided fine, white stone that could be cut into smooth blocks to form the flawless outer casings of pyramids. Further south, the immense sandstone quarries at Jebel el Silsila supplied the bulk material for temples and palaces throughout the New Kingdom, its relatively soft stone allowing for rapid extraction. And from the far south, at Aswan, came the most challenging and prestigious material of all, red granite. This incredibly hard stone was quarried in truly massive obelisks and statues, a testament to Egyptian engineering prowess. Workers would drill lines of holes, drive in wooden wedges, and then soak the wood until it expanded, slowly and precisely cracking the granite free from the bedrock. These stones were then loaded onto colossal barges and floated down the Nile to construction sites, a logistical miracle that connected the bounty of the desert to the ambition of the civilization. Beyond its mineral and stone wealth, the desert also provided an unexpected strategic gift: unparalleled natural defense. The harsh, waterless expanse on both sides of the Nile Valley acted as a gigantic, impassable moat, shielding the kingdom from large-scale invasion for centuries. Any army approaching from the east or west would face a death march through hundreds of miles of searing heat with no reliable sources of water or food. This geographic fact allowed Egypt to develop its culture, government, and society with a degree of security and isolation that was rare in the ancient world. They didn't need to build vast walls along their borders. The desert itself was their greatest fortress. The few established routes through these deserts, like those leading to the Oasis or the Red Sea ports, were easily monitored and controlled by small, strategically placed fortresses. This meant Egypt could choose when to engage with the outside world through trade or military campaign, rather than constantly being forced to defend its heartland. The desert, in its terrifying emptiness, became the silent guardian of the Black Land, allowing the civilization within to flourish with a sense of order and permanence that was directly tied to the very environment that seemed to threaten it. Even with their ingeniously managed fields and bountiful harvests, the ancient Egyptian diet was smartly diversified by those willing to venture into the margins where the Black Land met the Red. The desert fringes and the wadis, those dry riverbeds that only flowed with water after a rare downpour, were not barren. To the Egyptian eye, they were a vast, open-air larder, offering a supplemental harvest of meat, plants, and sweets that required a different kind of knowledge, not the organized science of irrigation, but the intimate generational wisdom of the tracker and the forager. This practice was less about desperation and more about adding valuable variety, protein, and flavor to a diet heavily reliant on bread and beer. Hunting provided the most exciting prizes. While the wealthy elite pursued large game like lions or wild cattle as a sport in their chariots, commoners sought more practical game that could feed a family. The swift gazelle was a highly prized target, its lean meat a welcome change from the usual fare. Hunters would often work in groups, using dogs to chase herds into waiting nets strung between the desert brush. Once entangled, the animals could be more easily captured. Smaller game, like the prolific desert hare, was also a common catch, providing a quick and nutritious meal. Perhaps the most remarkable and dangerous quarry was the ostrich. These massive, fast-running birds were hunted not only for their meat, but for their spectacular feathers, used in fans and ceremonial headdresses, and their strong eggshells, which were carved into beautiful vessels and jewelry. A single ostrich egg could provide a meal for an entire family. The pursuit of honey was another adventure that took Egyptians deep into the wild. They cherished honey as their primary sweetener, using it in cakes, medicines, and as a preservative. But acquiring it was a treacherous task. Professional honey hunters would follow special guide birds, now known as honey guides, which would flutter and chirp to lead them to wild beehives, often nestled precariously in desert cliffs or within hollow trees. Braving a furious swarm of bees, the hunters would use smoke to sedate the insects before carefully breaking open the hive to extract the honeycomb. This was a skilled and courageous profession, and the resulting golden honey was a luxury product worth a considerable risk. The desert also offered a surprising array of plant life for those who knew where and when to look. After the occasional winter rains, the arid landscape would undergo a miraculous, if brief, transformation. Tough, drought-resistant plants would burst into life, and foraging parties would head out to gather these free gifts from the land. They collected the nutritious seeds of desert grasses, which should be ground into a rough but edible flour. They harvested the tangy fruits of the Christ's thorn shrub, known as nabk, and the small, sugary dom fruits of the doom palm, salty, succulent plants like samphire, found along the marshy edges of the delta, added a sharp, briny flavor to their cooking. This deep botanical knowledge meant that even in the harshest seasons, the desert could still provide, ensuring that the people of the Nile never relied on a single source of sustenance, but instead thrived by mastering every aspect of their complex and generous environment. Yet for all the bounty they coaxed from the land and foraged from the wild, the ancient Egyptians knew that true mastery of their environment required powerful allies. They found these partners not in other humans, but in the animal kingdom, through a process of domestication that transformed their society from a simple farming culture into an economic and agricultural powerhouse. This was a profound partnership, a symbiotic relationship where humans provided protection and sustenance, and animals provided the raw muscle, renewable resources, and mobility that supercharged Egyptian civilization. These creatures became living, breathing tools, each one perfectly suited to a specific and vital role in the grand machinery of survival. The most revered of all these partners was undoubtedly cattle. In Egyptian society, cattle were far more than mere livestock. They were a fundamental measure of wealth and status, deeply intertwined with religion and iconography. The mighty bull, with its raw strength, was associated with the pharaoh himself, embodying power and fertility, but their practical value was just as immense. A team of oxen-castrated male cattle hitched to a simple wooden plow could prepare a field in a fraction of the time it took a man with a handheld hoe. This allowed farmers to cultivate larger areas of land more efficiently, directly increasing the food surplus that supported cities, priests, and monument builders. Beyond their labor, cattle were a renewable source of wealth. They provided milk, a crucial source of protein and fat, which could also be processed into cheese and yogurt for longer storage. Even their dung had value, being collected and dried to be used as a slow-burning, efficient fuel for cooking fires in a land largely devoid of trees. For traversing the vast, unforgiving landscapes that surrounded the Nile Valley, no human invention could rival the endurance and resilience of the donkey. Native to Northeast Africa, donkeys were the undisputed engines of Egyptian logistics and trade. Their ability to carry heavy loads, often up to 100 pounds or more, while requiring minimal water and surviving on coarse, scrubby forage made them the perfect vessel for desert travel. Donkey caravans became the lifelines that connected isolated mining expeditions in the eastern desert to the Nile, transporting tons of precious gold, turquoise, and copper. They carried grain to remote fortresses, pottery to trading posts, and water to work gangs in the royal quarries. This humble animal was the courier and the trucker of the ancient world, enabling the flow of goods and materials that built and sustained the kingdom, turning isolated communities into a connected, thriving state. While cattle provided power and donkeys provided transport, it was smaller ruminants like goats and sheep that provided the essential day-to-day sustenance for ordinary Egyptian families. These animals were the walking larders of the ancient world, offering a compact and manageable source of wealth. Goats, incredibly hardy and adaptable, could thrive on the scrubby vegetation at the desert's edge, land unusable for agriculture. They provided rich milk, which was easier to digest for some than cow's milk and could be turned into cheese. Their meat was a valued source of protein, and their skin could be tanned into durable leather for bags, straps, and containers. Sheep, initially raised primarily for their meat, underwent a significant transformation during the course of Egyptian history. Early sheep had coarse hair, but through selective breeding, the Egyptians developed a breed with a fine, woolly fleece. This opened up a whole new industry, textile production. While linen remained the primary fabric, wool became incredibly important for heavier blankets, cloaks, and carpets, providing vital warmth during the surprisingly cold desert nights. The management of these flocks, herding them to pasture, protecting them from predators, and selectively breeding them for desirable traits became a specialized and respected profession. Together, goats and sheep offered a diversified and resilient source of nutrition and materials, ensuring that even if a grain harvest was poor, a family could still rely on their flock for milk, meat, and fiber. This animal partnership was not a luxury, it was a foundational strategy, weaving these creatures into the very fabric of daily life and making the incredible story of Egyptian survival possible. While the Nile was the undeniable heart of their civilization, the ancient Egyptians' genius for water management extended far beyond its banks. Their survival in a land defined by scarcity required them to become experts in locating and conserving every single drop of moisture the harsh environment could offer. To truly thrive and expand their influence, they had to solve the critical problem of how to sustain life away from the river's immediate reach in the deep desert, at remote mining outposts, and along the vital trade routes that connected them to the wider world. This challenge spurred them to develop remarkably sophisticated techniques for tapping into hidden water sources, turning seemingly hopeless landscapes into traversable and even habitable territories. One of their most crucial strategies involved a deep understanding of geology and the behavior of water underground. They learned to read the landscape for signs of hidden moisture, particularly within the wadis, those dry riverbeds that carved through the desert plateaus. While these channels were bone dry for most of the year, everyone knew they were the ghosts of ancient waterways. The Egyptians understood that after a rare desert rainstorm, water wouldn't just flow along the surface and vanish. Vast quantities of it would seep deep down through the sand and gravel of the wadi floor, accumulating and being stored in natural underground reservoirs known as aquifers. The key was to dig down to reach this life-saving treasure. This led to the construction of wells, but these were far from simple holes in the ground. Digging a successful well was a skilled undertaking that combined empirical knowledge with sheer, back-breaking labor. Teams of workers would descend into these ever-deepening pits, passing baskets of sand and rock up to the surface. They often had to reinforce the walls with stones or wooden supports to prevent collapses as they delved dozens of feet downward. The goal was to hit the water table, that invisible line where the ground became saturated. The water that filled these wells was not the fresh, flowing water of the Nile. It was often brackish and mineral-heavy, having filtered through layers of desert rock. Yet, for a caravan of donkeys or a garrison of soldiers stationed at a lonely desert fortress, this water was the difference between life and a parched death. These wells transformed the wadis from mere landmarks into vital pit stops, a network of natural rest stations that made long-distance desert travel and resource extraction possible. But wells were a passive system, reliant on water that had already seeped into the ground from past rains. The Egyptians also developed active, ingenious methods to capture rainfall the moment it fell, a precious and unpredictable event they were determined not to waste. In areas with rocky outcrops and natural catchments, they engineered simple but effective systems to harvest every possible drop. They would identify large, sloping stone surfaces that naturally channeled water during a storm. Then, they would carefully carve shallow gutters or channels into the rock itself, directing the torrent of runoff into waiting man-made reservoirs. These reservoirs, often carved directly into the bedrock or lined with stone and waterproof plaster, were their desert cistern. Their design was brilliant in its simplicity. Many were built deep and narrow to minimize the surface area exposed to the relentless sun, drastically reducing evaporation. Some were even covered with stone slabs to keep the water cool and clean, and to prevent sand from blowing in. The capture of this rainwater was particularly valuable because it was typically fresher and sweeter than well water, making it a prized resource for drinking. A single intense downpour could fill a large cistern, providing a reliable water supply for weeks or even months, sustaining a mining expedition or a military patrol until the next rain arrived. This ability to create their own localized oases through clever engineering allowed the Egyptians to project their power and maintain a presence in the most remote and inhospitable corners of their world, proving that their mastery of water was the true source of their resilience. Of course, the very materials they chose to build with were a direct and brilliant response to their environment. While we marvel at the majestic pyramids and temples of carved stone, the overwhelming majority of ancient Egyptians lived, worked, and slept in homes made of mud brick. This humble material, often dismissed as primitive, was in fact a technological masterpiece of passive climate control. The process of making these bricks was simple yet effective. They would mix the rich Nile silt with water and straw, often the chaff left over from threshing wheat and barley, and pack the mixture into wooden molds before leaving the blocks to bake solid under the relentless sun. The straw wasn't just a binding agent. It acted like rebar in concrete, preventing the bricks from cracking as they dried and shrank, creating a durable and incredibly insulating building block. These sun-dried mud bricks became the primary shield against the desert's extremes. Builders would construct walls of immense thickness, sometimes several feet deep. This mass was their secret weapon. During the scorching daylight hours, the sun's intense heat would beat down on the exterior walls, but instead of rapidly conducting that heat inside, the thick, dense mud bricks absorbed it slowly, acting as a thermal buffer. The searing temperatures outside would take many hours to penetrate all the way to the interior, meaning that for most of the day, the inside of the house remained noticeably cooler. Then, as the cold desert night descended and outside temperatures plummeted, the process would reverse. The heat stored within the walls would slowly radiate inward, gently warming the home's interior and fighting off the nighttime chill. This natural regulation created a stable, livable environment inside, a calm refuge from the dramatic swings of the outdoor climate. The design of these homes further enhanced this cooling effect through clever and intentional airflow management. Windows were not added as an afterthought. They were strategically placed architectural features, and they were always small and set high up on the walls. This served two critical purposes. First, the high placement allowed the hot air that naturally rises to accumulate near the ceiling and escape through the opening, drawing it out of the living space below. Second, the small size prevented large areas of direct sunlight from pouring in and heating up the rooms like an oven, while still allowing for essential light and air exchange. The real genius, however, was in creating cross-ventilation. Doors and windows were positioned directly across from one another whenever possible. This alignment allowed the slightest breeze, often coming off the Nile in the evening, to be channeled directly through the home, flushing out stale, hot air and replacing it with cooler drafts in a natural and energy-free form of air conditioning. Perhaps the most enjoyable and socially central cooling feature was the courtyard, a design element found in everything from a modest farmer's house to the sprawling villas of the elite. This central, unroofed outdoor room was the heart of the home, and it functioned as a perfectly engineered microclimate. Its open design allowed it to act as a giant light well and a heat sink. During the night, the exposed courtyard floor and walls would radiate their accumulated heat straight up into the clear night sky, becoming intensely cold. Then, as the sun climbed the next day, this pre-cooled mass would help keep the entire house comfortable. Families would often use this shaded, cool space for cooking, crafting, and socializing during the hotter parts of the day. Rooftops also served a similar dual purpose. After the heat of the day dissipated, families would often take their sleeping mats up to the flat roof to catch the night breezes, using the vast open sky as their ceiling and turning the entire structure into a multi-level climate control system that worked in harmony with the natural rhythms of the desert. This mastery of their built environment extended to the very clothes on their backs. where practicality and profound cultural wisdom were woven into every thread. The ancient Egyptian approach to dressing for the desert was a brilliant and holistic adaptation, a sartorial science developed over millennia to protect the body from one of the most relentless suns on the planet. They understood that survival wasn't just about finding food and water. It was about safeguarding the human body itself from the devastating effects of dehydration and sun exposure. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity and universally adopted across social classes, from the laborer in the field to the vizier in the royal court. Garments crafted almost exclusively from lightweight, breathable, and brilliantly white linen. The choice of material was the first and most critical layer of their defense. Linen, spun from the fibers of the flax plant they cultivated so expertly, possessed innate properties that made it the perfect fabric for a hot climate. Its structure is fundamentally different from wool or cotton. Linen fibers are hollow and highly absorbent, capable of wicking moisture away from the skin with remarkable efficiency. When a person perspired, the linen would quickly absorb that sweat and pull it to the outer surface of the fabric, where the vast, dry desert air could evaporate it almost instantly. This process of evaporative cooling is a powerful natural mechanism, and linen's ability to facilitate it so effectively meant that wearing clothes actually helped keep the body cooler than being naked under the blazing sun. The fabric was also incredibly durable and grew softer with repeated washing, making it comfortable for long-term wear in abrasive, sandy conditions. The iconic white color of their clothing was not an arbitrary aesthetic choice, but a vital technological feature. In a landscape dominated by the blindingly bright sun and its radiant heat, white acted as a perfect reflector. Dark colors absorb a wide spectrum of light energy, converting it into heat and causing the wearer to overheat rapidly. White, by contrast, reflects a significant portion of the solar radiation that strikes it, deflecting that energy back into the atmosphere instead of allowing it to be absorbed by the body. By dressing in white, the Egyptians were essentially creating a personal, reflective shield that minimized heat gain, allowing them to work and travel for longer periods without succumbing to heatstroke. This principle is the same reason why Bedouin tribes today traditionally wear long, flowing white robes, and why modern engineers recommend light-colored clothing for extreme heat. Beyond temperature regulation, their clothing provided essential protection from the sun's damaging ultraviolet radiation. The typical Egyptian garment was designed for maximum coverage. Men wore a simple wrapped kilt or a longer skirt, often pairing it with a loose sleeved shirt or a tunic for added protection. Women wore ankle-length, sheath dresses or loose robes that covered their shoulders and arms. This was not about modesty in the modern sense. It was a practical response to a deadly environmental threat. Exposed skin would have quickly burned, blistered, and become susceptible to infection. Long hours of repeated exposure would have led to severe long-term damage and potentially skin cancers. By covering up with lightweight layers, they created a physical barrier against the sun's rays, while the breathability of the linen prevented this coverage from becoming stifling. They often completed this ensemble with head coverings. Workers wore simple headcloths or straw hats to shade their necks and faces, while the wealthy donned elaborate striated wigs, which were not just symbols of status, but all provided a layer of insulation and protection for the scalp from the sun's direct glare. This practical necessity was seamlessly elevated into a cultural and spiritual value. The Egyptians associated linen with purity, light, and the divine. Priests were required to wear only pristine white linen garments and to shave their entire bodies to maintain ritual cleanliness, practices that had their roots in very practical hygiene considerations for preventing lice and disease in a hot climate. The whiteness of their clothes became synonymous with Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth and balance that stood against the chaos of the desert. So, in their daily choice of attire, an ancient Egyptian was not just making a decision about comfort. They were participating in a deeply ingrained cultural system that linked survival, practicality, and spiritual belief into a single, elegant piece of woven cloth. All this planning and harvesting would mean nothing if they couldn't make their bounty last. In a climate of relentless heat, food spoilage was a constant and dangerous threat, a race against invisible forces of decay that could wipe out a season's hard work in days. The ancient Egyptians, ever the ingenious problem solvers, refused to accept this. They became pioneers of food preservation, developing a sophisticated arsenal of techniques to outsmart the desert heat and ensure a stable food supply through the seasons, turning temporary abundance into long-term security. One of their most vital and widespread methods was the art of drying and salting, a practice perfectly suited to their sun-drenched environment. This was especially crucial for exploiting the Nile's other great gift, fish. The river teemed with Nile perch, catfish, and mullet, providing a massive source of protein, but fish is notoriously perishable. Their solution was elegant and effective. They would gut and fillet their catch, then liberally coat the pieces in salt, either from the Mediterranean coast or from desert salt flats. The salt acted as a powerful preservative by drawing out the moisture that bacteria and enzymes need to thrive. Then, they would lay the salted fish out on wide, flat racks on the riverbank or on their sun-baked mud brick roofs, allowing the intense, dry desert air to do the rest of the work. Within days, the fish would be transformed into tough, leathery strips that were lightweight, impervious to spoilage, and could be stored for months. This preserved fish, known as salted gray mullet or bersha, became a staple protein for laborers, soldiers, and travelers, a durable, nutritious, and portable food source that powered the civilization. This same principle was applied to meat, particularly from ducks, geese, and cattle. While fresh meat was a luxury often reserved for feasts and the wealthy, preserving it allowed its nutritional value to be extended. Joints of meat would be heavily salted and then hung in the dry, ventilated upper areas of a home or storage building to air dry. In some cases, they might have used a light smoking over a fire to add flavor and further inhibit microbial growth, creating an early form of jerky. This process not only prevented waste from large communal hunts or ritual sacrifices, but also created a valuable trade good and a reliable emergency food store for times when fresh game was scarce or the Nile's bounty was low. But the absolute cornerstone of their survival, the commodity that truly measured the wealth of the state, was grain. Losing a harvested store of emmer wheat or barley to mold, insects, or rodents was a catastrophe they went to incredible lengths to prevent. Their solution was large-scale, centralized storage in brilliantly designed silos. These were not simple piles of grain in a corner, they were masterpieces of practical engineering. The most common design was a large mud brick cylinder with rounded, slightly tapered walls and a narrow opening at the top. This shape was chosen for very specific reasons. The smooth, curved interior walls offered no corners where moisture could accumulate or pests could easily hide. The narrow opening at the top minimized the surface area exposed to the humid air, significantly reducing the risk of spoilage. The process of sealing these silos was a community affair. Once the silo was filled with grain, a protective layer of straw or reeds would be placed on top. Then, a thick, airtight seal of Nile mud plaster would be smeared over the entire opening, effectively locking the harvest in a dry, dark, and oxygen-poor environment where spoilage organisms couldn't thrive. To retrieve grain, a worker would simply break a small section of the seal, scoop out what was needed, and then reseal it. This system was so effective that grain could be stored for years, acting as the nation's insurance policy against poor harvests and the lifeblood that fed the thousands of workers not directly involved in farming, from scribes and priests to the armies of laborers building the monuments we still admire today. Beyond these macro techniques, they also employed clever, small-scale tricks that show a nuanced understanding of their environment. Archaeologists have found evidence of them using natural desiccants, substances that absorb ambient moisture, to create microclimates of dryness within storage containers. They would sometimes place lumps of natron, a naturally occurring salt they also used in mummification, alongside stored food in sealed jars or bags. The natron would actively pull any residual moisture from the air inside the container, keeping dried fruits, legumes, or even precious spices bone dry and safe from the ever-present threat of mold. This attention to detail, from the vast state-run granaries to the sealed jar in a family's home, reveals a culture that left nothing to chance. Their food preservation methods were a silent, daily victory over the desert, a testament to their relentless drive to not just survive the harshness of their world, but to build a legacy of resilience within it. Mastering the rhythms of their world required more than just observing the Nile's rise and fall. It demanded a system to measure and predict time itself. The ancient Egyptians responded to this challenge by creating one of history's most accurate and enduring calendars, a brilliant fusion of celestial observation and agricultural necessity. This was not an abstract intellectual exercise. It was a vital tool for survival, a way to synchronize every aspect of their society with the immutable cycles of their environment. Their year was cleanly divided into 3 seasons, each perfectly aligned with the life-giving pulse of the river, and each bearing a name that reflected its core function. This clear, practical structure organized the entire rhythm of Egyptian life, from the humblest farmer planting his seeds to the pharaoh ordering the beginning of a great construction project. The first season, Akhit, meaning inundation, was the time of the flood. Beginning around mid-July, this was when the Nile would generously overflow its banks, submerging the valley under a shallow, life-giving lake. For the farmers, this was a period of forced inactivity on the land, but not of idleness. It became a time of communal labor and royal service, when the massive workforces that built the pyramids and temples were mobilized. With their fields underwater, the population was free to contribute their labor to state projects, knowing that the river was simultaneously replenishing the fertility of their land. This was followed by Parat, the season of emergence or growth, when the waters receded, leaving the perfectly saturated and silt-enriched fields ready for sowing. This was the busiest time in the agricultural calendar, a race to plant the seeds that would feed the nation. Finally, Shemu, the harvest season, arrived under the hot, dry sun. This was a period of intense labor to reap the abundant crops of grain before the cycle began anew with the next inundation. This tripartite system was so intuitive and effective that it governed Egyptian civilization for thousands of years, a testament to its perfect harmony with the natural world. But a calendar based solely on the Nile's behavior had one potential flaw. It was reactive. To truly plan ahead, they needed a way to predict the inundation's arrival, and for this, they looked to the heavens. Their key celestial marker was the star we know as Sirius, which they called Sopdet, personified as a goddess. After a period of about 70 days where it was absent from the night sky, Sirius would reappear just before dawn in the east. This event, known as its heliacal rising, was a moment of tremendous importance. It occurred annually in mid-July, coinciding almost perfectly with the beginning of the Nile's flood and the new year. The return of the dog star was therefore a divine signal, a dependable celestial alarm clock that heralded the imminent arrival of the life-giving waters. This connection was so precise that the Egyptian civil calendar, which consisted of 12 30-day months plus 5 extra days, was designed to keep this celestial and terrestrial event in sync, making it far more accurate than any other calendar of its time. This sophisticated understanding of the stars served a dual purpose, extending from the celestial to the profoundly terrestrial. The same star patterns that dictated their calendar became essential tools for navigation across the vast, featureless expanse of the desert. Traveling by day was a punishing ordeal under the scorching sun, but journeying by night offered cooler temperatures and a glittering roadmap overhead. For traders, miners, and soldiers moving through the western desert or the Sinai, losing your way meant almost certain death. To avoid this, they became expert celestial navigators. They learned to identify circumpolar stars, those that never dip below the horizon, and use them as fixed points of reference. By observing the rotation of these unchanging stars around the celestial pole, they could accurately determine the direction of true north and maintain a straight course through the trackless dune. The constellations were their landmarks, and specific stars served as their guiding beacons. Just as Sirius announced the flood, other bright stars would have been used to mark specific routes or indicate the passage of time during a long night's journey. This practice required immense knowledge, passed down through generations of desert travelers. It transformed an intimidating, blank canvas of sand into a navigable space, with the Milky Way acting as a glittering river in the sky to guide them just as the Nile guided them at home. This ability to read the night sky was a critical skill that enabled the expansion of Egyptian influence, allowing for the exploitation of distant resources and the maintenance of trade networks that would have been impossible without the celestial wisdom, weaving a connection between the cosmos above and the sand below. These long, dusty tracks across the endless sand were far more than simple paths. They were the vital economic arteries of the kingdom, the desert highways that connected the insulated Nile Valley to the immense wealth and resources of distant lands. The most legendary of these routes was the Darb el Arbain, the terrifying and awe-inspiring Road of 40 Days. This was not a journey for the faint of heart. It stretched over 1,200 brutal miles from the lush Nile at Asiyut, deep into the heart of the Sudan, ultimately reaching the rich lands of Darfur. The name itself, commemorating the 40 days of relentless travel required to complete its most arduous stretch, speaks to the immense scale and danger of the undertaking. This route was the primary conduit for one of Egypt's most vital commodities, human capital. For centuries, vast caravans of thousands of donkeys and later camels traversed this hellscape, not just carrying goods, but transporting countless captives from the interior of Africa. These individuals were destined for lives of servitude in Egypt, a tragic and dark aspect of this trade that fueled the labor force of the state. But the Darb el Arbain also carried immense treasures northward: elephant tusks for priceless ivory, the fragrant gum Arabic used in incense and medicines, exotic animal skins, and the precious feathers of the ostrich. To make such a monumental journey possible, travelers relied on a string of remote, miraculous lifesavers, the Oasis. These were not mere puddles in the sand. They were isolated islands of staggering fertility in a sea of barren rock and sand, functioning as vital way stations, economic hubs, and sometimes even places of exile or military outposts. The Great Oasis, known today as Kargut Oasis, stood as the southern sentinel, the last major stop before caravans plunged into the true waterless depths of the desert on the Darb el Arbain. Here, weary travelers could find not just water, but a thriving community. They could restock their supplies with dates, grapes, and grain cultivated in the oasis's lush gardens, repair their worn-out sandals and leather water skins with local craftsmen, and allow their exhausted donkeys to graze and recover strength before the next deadly leg of the journey. Further along, the Dakka Oasis served as another critical node in this network. It was famous for its bountiful vineyards and orchards, producing not just food but also wine that was highly prized back in the Nile Valley. The presence of a permanent, settled population in these oases meant there were potters making sturdy water jars, weavers mending torn sacks, and local guides for hire who possessed the irreplaceable knowledge of the shifting dunes and hidden dangers that lay ahead. These oases transformed from simple watering holes into full-service logistic centers, complete with storage facilities, administrative buildings to track and tax the goods flowing through, and even small fortresses garrisoned with soldiers to protect the invaluable flow of commerce from raiders. The Egyptian state invested heavily in these outposts, digging and maintaining their wells, building way stations, and ensuring their stability, because they understood that the prosperity and security of the entire kingdom depended on the resilience of these distant green dots on the map. The desert highways and their oasis way stations were a testament to Egyptian ingenuity and determination, proving that their civilization's reach extended far beyond the Nile, woven into the very fabric of the desert itself. Yet the true wonder of these oases lay not in their strategic location, but in what their inhabitants managed to create within them. Far from being mere pit stops offering basic sustenance, they blossomed into incredibly productive and self-sufficient agricultural powerhouses, mastering the art of cultivation in isolation. The key to this agricultural miracle was their unique and precious water source. While the Nile Valley relied on the annual flood, the oases tapped into a different kind of treasure: vast subterranean reservoirs of fossil water. This was ancient rainwater that had seeped into the aquifers millennia ago, and it was accessed through a remarkable feat of engineering known as man-made springs. In some oases, the water pressure from these deep aquifers was so immense that it actually forced the water to the surface naturally, creating bubbling pools that the locals simply had to channel into their fields. In other areas, they dug deep wells and used the ancient water lifting device known as the shaduf to patiently raise the life-giving water bucket by bucket, day after day, to irrigate their crops. This constant, reliable water supply, combined with the intense desert sun, created an almost perfect environment for growing some of the most prized commodities in the ancient world. The undisputed king of oasis agriculture was the date palm. These majestic trees were far more than just a source of food. They were the very backbone of the oasis ecosystem. Their tall, slender trunks provided essential shade that protected more delicate crops like grapevines and fruit trees from the scorching sun. Their fibrous leaves were woven into baskets, mats, and roofing materials, while their trunks provided timber in a land utterly devoid of other trees. And of course, the dates themselves were a caloric powerhouse, sweet, nutrient-dense, and easily dried and preserved, making them an ideal food for storing or for packing on long desert journeys. An oasis without date palms was simply unimaginable. They were the pillars that held this miniature world together, but the agricultural innovation didn't stop there. The oases, particularly Bahariya and Dakta, became famous throughout Egypt for producing another luxury item, wine. This was a remarkable achievement. The process of viticulture is notoriously finicky, requiring just the right balance of sun, water, and soil. The oasis farmers, however, found that their unique microclimates and mineral-rich soil produced grapes with a distinct and powerful flavor. They cultivated extensive vineyards, painstakingly tending the vines and harvesting the grapes to be crushed and fermented in large ceramic jars. This oasis wine, often transported in distinctive amphorae with clay seals stamped with the name of the estate, became a highly sought-after product in the Nile Valley. It was a luxury good, consumed by the elite during festivals and offered as libations to the gods, and its production turned these remote settlements into vital centers of a specialized economy, proving that the desert could produce not just subsistence, but splendor. Beyond dates and wine, the oases also supplied the Nile Valley with a surprising variety of other goods. They grew olives, pressing them for their precious oil, which was used in cooking, lighting lamps, and as a base for perfumes and unguent. They cultivated henna, a plant used for dyeing hair and skin, and which held important ritual significance. The isolation of the oases also made them ideal places for less common pursuits, such as beekeeping, providing honey that rivaled that harvested from wild desert hives. This diverse output transformed the oases from simple way stations into critical economic partners. The goods they produced were loaded onto donkeys and camels and sent in caravan after caravan back to the Nile, where they were traded for the grains, linens, pottery, and other manufactured goods the oasis dwellers could not easily produce themselves. This reciprocal trade relationship wove the distant oases tightly into the economic and cultural fabric of ancient Egypt, demonstrating that even the most remote green islands in the sand were indispensable threads in the great tapestry of the kingdom. This profound connection to their harsh environment was woven directly into the very fabric of their spirituality, where the desert's dual nature was personified in a powerful and complex pantheon of gods. The Egyptians did not view the vast expanse of sand as a single, monolithic entity of pure danger. Instead, they possessed a remarkably nuanced understanding, splitting its personality between two distinct and powerful deities who represented its contrasting faces. This spiritual mapping of the landscape reveals a people who sought not just to survive their world, but to comprehend its deeper meaning, assigning divine purpose to both its gifts and its terrors. On one side stood the dangerous and chaotic aspect of the desert, embodied by the formidable and fearsome god Set, also known as Seth. He was not merely a god of dry places, he was the deity of the violent, unpredictable, and life-threatening forces that the wilderness represented. Set was the lord of the arid eastern desert, the brutal mountains where the sun rose, and most importantly, the terrifying storms that would occasionally erupt without warning. These storms were not the life-giving rains of other cultures. They were chaotic events of scorching wind, blinding sand, and crashing thunder that could erase caravan trails, bury wells, and strip the flesh from bone. Set was the spirit of this sudden, senseless violence. the embodiment of the desert's capacity for chaos and disorder that constantly threatened the cultivated order of the Black Land. He was the god of strangers, of foreign lands, and of confusion, and his most famous myth saw him murdering his own brother, the good god Osiris, an act that symbolized how the desert's chaos could shatter the harmony of the Nile Valley. The Egyptians respected Set's power and even called upon him in times of war for his fierce strength, but they always viewed him with a healthy dose of caution and fear, knowing his domain was one of inherent danger. In stark contrast to Set's violent chaos was the more benevolent, protective spirit of the desert's western reaches, personified by the god Ha, whose name literally means Lord of the West. While Set ruled the harsh, rocky eastern desert, Ha was the deity of the vast, dune sea of the Libyan desert to the west. His domain was not one of sudden storms, but of immense, silent, and awe-inspiring expanse. The west held a deeply sacred significance for the Egyptians, as it was the direction where the sun died each evening, sinking into the underworld. Because of this, the western desert became intimately associated with the realm of the dead, with cemeteries and necropolises always being placed on the west bank of the Nile. Ha, as its lord, thus became a protective guardian of the dead on their journey into the afterlife. He is often depicted in art as a robust man bearing the hieroglyph for desert on his head, sometimes shown guiding the deceased safely into his domain. He represented the desert not as a place of death, but as a necessary passageway to eternal life, a protective, if barren, womb that led to rebirth. This view transformed the intimidating western sands from a mere wasteland into a sacred landscape, a necessary part of the cosmic cycle. This divine dichotomy between Set and Ha shows an incredibly sophisticated environmental psychology. They did not simplistically label the entire desert as evil. Instead, they recognized it had a split personality, a violent, masculine, and destructive aspect in the east, and a more silent, protective, and funerary aspect in the west. This spiritual framework allowed them to navigate their world with a deeper understanding. A merchant embarking on a trading expedition into the eastern desert might make a small offering to Set, not to worship him, but to appease his chaotic nature and plead for safe passage. Meanwhile, a family burying a loved one on the west bank would take comfort in the protective presence of Ha, believing their relative was entering his guarded realm. This nuanced belief system was a direct reflection of their lived experience. The desert was both a deadly adversary and a sacred protector. It provided the materials for their greatest achievements and the natural defenses that secured their borders, yet it could also kill in an instant with a misplaced step or a sudden storm. By dividing its nature between two gods, they could intellectually and spiritually manage this paradox, honoring the desert's power while finding a way to coexist with its immense, demanding presence. And speaking of navigating that treacherous eastern desert, no one understood its secrets better than the Medjay, a nomadic people who turned their inherited knowledge of this harsh landscape into a legendary career as the Egyptian state's ultimate desert specialist. Originally hailing from the arid lands of Nubia to the south, the Medjay were not Egyptians in the traditional sense. They were a distinct cultural group who lived a life perfectly adapted to the very environment that the Nile dwellers found so intimidating. While the farmers of the Black Land were masters of the irrigated field, the Medjay were masters of the trackless waste, and the Egyptian military machine quickly recognized that this unique expertise was a resource they could not afford to ignore. Their value lay in a skill set that simply could not be taught in a barracks or learned from a scroll. From childhood, a Medjay youth would be taught how to read the desert itself. They could look at a seemingly random scattering of stones and know it was an ancient trail. They could feel a shift in the wind and predict a coming sandstorm hours before it arrived, giving a column of troops precious time to seek shelter. They knew where to find the hidden seeps of water in a dry wadi bed, the locations of secret caves that offered shade, and the paths that led through seemingly impassable mountain ranges. This wasn't just knowledge, it was a form of deep, ancestral wisdom passed down through generations, and for an Egyptian army needing to move troops and supplies through the eastern deserts to launch a campaign against its rivals, such a guide was utterly priceless. Initially hired as specialized scouts and mercenaries, The medjay's role expanded dramatically over time, especially during the New Kingdom period. They became the elite paramilitary force tasked with policing the desert borders, a duty known as medjay, which eventually became the title for their entire corps. Think of them as the special forces, the rangers, and the border patrol of their day, all rolled into one. They were deployed to guard the valuable mining and quarrying expeditions, ensuring that the convoys of gold and turquoise made it safely back to the Nile without being ambushed by other desert tribes or bandits. They manned the lonely fortresses that dotted the trade routes, their keen eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. Their reputation for loyalty, toughness, and unparalleled skill made them trusted agents of the pharaoh himself. Beyond military duties, they were often tasked with high-stakes missions like escorting important dignitaries on desert roads, investigating crimes in remote regions, and even providing security for the royal necropolis at Thebes, protecting the tombs of the kings from the very real threat of grave robbers. In a civilization defined by its orderly, settled agriculture, the medjay were the wild card, the experts who thrived in the chaos beyond the river's edge, and their unique partnership with the Egyptian state became one of history's most compelling examples of how a society can strengthen itself not by conquering outsiders, but by embracing and harnessing their unique strength. These organized campaigns into the Sinai were monumental undertakings, state-sponsored operations that combined military precision, logistical genius, and raw human endurance. They were far more than just groups of miners with picks. They were complex, self-contained missions that represented the pharaoh's power projected deep into the wilderness. Before a single stone could be extracted, a royal scribe would meticulously plan the expedition, drawing from records of previous voyages to calculate the exact number of workers, soldiers, craftsmen, and donkeys required, and perhaps most critically, the vast quantities of food, water, and tools that would need to be transported to sustain the operation for months at a time. The departure from the Nile Valley was a major event, a long caravan of men and animals snaking its way eastward, leaving the guaranteed safety of the Black Land for the uncertainties of the desert, all to secure the precious blue-green stone and the essential metal that fueled the kingdom's ambition. Upon reaching the designated mining area, such as the famous sites at Sarabit el-Khadim or Wadi Maghara, the first order of business was establishing a temporary home in the rocks. They didn't have the luxury of pre-built structures. They created a functional settlement from scratch. Using local stone, they would construct simple, dry stone walls to create rough shelters and windbreaks. They built grinding stones for processing grain, small mud brick ovens for baking bread, and laid out areas for repairing tools and organizing supplies. This remote outpost became a bustling, if stark, industrial village, a tiny bubble of Egyptian order and industry dropped into the vast, silent expanse of the Sinai Mountains. A dedicated team of soldiers would immediately establish a perimeter and post lookouts on the high ridges, not just for defense against potential raiders, but to monitor the horizon for the ever-present danger of sudden, devastating sandstorms. The actual process of extracting the turquoise was back-breaking, dangerous work that required multiple specialized skills. The miners' primary tools were stone hammers and mauls made from dense, heavy dolomite, along with chisels and picks made of the very copper they were sometimes there to find. Their goal was to follow a seam of the blue-green stone, often embedded within a much harder matrix of sandstone. The work was a constant, deafening rhythm of pounding and chipping, a slow, deliberate assault on the mountain. Fire setting was a common technique to shatter the stubborn rock. They would build a fierce fire directly against the rock face, heating it intensely, and then suddenly douse it with water or vinegar, causing the stone to fracture and crack from the thermal shock. This method was effective but perilous, filling the cramped tunnels with suffocating smoke and heat and risking unpredictable rock falls. Once a promising chunk of rock was freed, it was carefully broken apart to reveal the tiny veins of turquoise within, which were then collected and sorted by grade, with the finest, most intensely colored pieces set aside as royal treasure. The real measure of Egyptian organizational genius, however, was not in the mining itself, but in the incredible logistical operation required to keep these remote camps alive. The Sinai Peninsula offered almost nothing in terms of sustenance. There was no fertile soil for crops, no herds of game to hunt, and most critically, no reliable source of fresh water. Every single thing needed to sustain hundreds of men for months. Every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every drop of drinking water had to be transported from the Nile Valley over hundreds of miles of harsh desert tracks. This was the sole responsibility of the donkey caravans. These supply trains were the absolute lifeline, and their scheduled arrival was undoubtedly the most anticipated event at the mining camp. They would arrive bearing immense loads of grain, barley, dates, dried fish, and ceramic jars filled with water and beer, all carefully calculated to last until the next caravan's arrival. The empty jars and worn-out sacks would be loaded back onto the donkeys for the return journey, a constant cycle of provision and resupply that turned the desert trails into a conveyor belt of state-sponsored survival. The success of the entire expedition and the flow of precious stones and metals back to the workshops of the Nile hinged entirely on the weary feet of donkeys and the meticulous planning that kept them moving. This strategic shift in burial practices led the pharaohs of the New Kingdom to a seemingly desolate and forbidding location, the remote sun-scorched valley we now call the Valley of the Kings. This was not a random choice, but a calculated masterstroke of environmental engineering. They turned their backs on the iconic pyramid, whose gleaming white limestone casing was a brilliant beacon for every thief in the land, and instead embraced the desert's natural defenses. The valley itself, a stark and winding wadi carved deep into the Theban Hills on the west bank of the Nile, offered a perfect combination of geological and geographical advantages that a human-made structure simply could not match. The most critical factor was the quality of the rock itself. This wasn't just any stone, it was a deep layer of dense, fine-grained limestone interspersed with softer strata of marl and shale. To the royal architects and stone cutters, this was an ideal canvas. The limestone was stable enough to allow for the excavation of vast, intricate tombs with multiple chambers and descending corridors without constant fear of collapse, yet it was still soft enough to be worked with the bronze and copper tools of the time. They learned to read the rock like a map, carefully avoiding natural fault lines and areas of weakness to ensure the long-term structural integrity of the tomb. This geological stability was the first and most important guarantee of eternity, providing a solid, permanent shell to protect the king's body and his immense funerary wealth. Perhaps even more vital than the rock's workability was the desert climate that encased it. The valley exists in a state of near-perfect aridity. The annual rainfall is almost zero, and the humidity levels are perpetually incredibly low. This created a naturally sterile environment, a sealed, desiccated vault where the organic materials essential to the burial could be preserved for millennia. The wood of the dazzlingly painted coffins and statues did not rot. The delicate linen wrappings of the mummy did not mold or disintegrate. The vibrant pigments on the tomb walls, made from mineral-based paints, did not fade or peel away with dampness. Even the food offerings left for the king's journey to the afterlife remained intact. This natural dehydration was a form of preservation as effective as any human-made technique, and it was provided free of charge by the desert itself, a perfect partnership between human intention and environmental condition. And then there was the location's unparalleled security. The valley is naturally secluded, hidden behind a towering, pyramid-shaped peak known as Elquin, which the ancients likely saw as a natural surrogate for the sacred pyramid form. The entrance to the valley was narrow and easily guarded. The royal necropolis was not a public cemetery, it was a restricted zone, a secret government project protected by a special police force known as the Medjay, those elite desert rangers. The tombs themselves were not monuments to be seen and admired, they were hidden holes in the ground. After the king's burial, the entrance was sealed, covered with rubble, and the exact location was meant to be forgotten. The labor crews who built the tombs were often conscripted from distant villages and sworn to secrecy, and the administrative records of the tomb's location were kept in the utmost confidence. The desert provided the ultimate camouflage. Its shifting sands and identical-looking cliffs made it incredibly difficult for anyone not in the know to locate a specific, unmarked tomb entrance. This strategy of concealment, leveraging the sheer anonymity and intimidating scale of the desert, was their best and only hope of outsmarting the resourceful tomb robbers who had plundered every pyramid before them. In the Valley of the Kings, the environment itself became the primary guardian of eternity, while the Valley of the Kings exemplifies how the Egyptians worked with the desert's natural defenses. Another incredible project from an earlier era demonstrates their ambition to actually reshape it entirely. Far to the north of Thebes, a vast natural depression in the Libyan desert presented a unique opportunity. This was the Fayum, a sprawling bowl of land that lies below sea level, its lowest point cradling a shallow saline lake known today as Lake Current. For centuries, it was a marginal region, a strange landscape of wetlands and salt flats on the very edge of the cultivated world. But during the Middle Kingdom, the pharaohs saw its untapped potential and launched one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects of the ancient world, a breathtaking feat of hydrological mastery that transformed the Fayum into a veritable breadbasket and a powerful testament to their ability to not just survive, but to fundamentally alter their environment on a grand scale. The genius of this reclamation project hinged on a single natural feature, a narrow channel known today as the Bahr Yusuf. This waterway acts as a kind of natural overflow valve, linking the Nile River near the city of Maidim to the Fayum Depression. The Egyptians understood that during the annual inundation, when the Nile swelled to its highest point, excess water would naturally spill into this channel and flow downhill into the Fayum Basin. Left uncontrolled, however, this created a vast seasonal marsh useful for some hunting and foraging, but completely unsuitable for large-scale, reliable agriculture. The water would simply flood the area chaotically and then largely evaporate or seep away, leaving behind brackish residues. The Middle Kingdom engineers, likely under the direction of powerful monarchs like Amenemhat III, refused to accept this chaotic process. Their vision was to tame it, to regulate this natural gift with precise human control. Their solution was a masterpiece of practical engineering. They didn't just dig a simple canal, they engineered an entire water management system. They widened, deepened, and straightened the natural course of the Bahr Yusuf to increase its capacity and ensure a consistent, powerful flow of water. But the true stroke of brilliance was the construction of a massive regulating dam, or a series of sluice gates at the entrance to the depression, near the modern town of El Lahan. This critical infrastructure acted like a giant tap. During the peak of the flood, when the Nile's waters were thick with the richest silt, the engineers could open these gates wide, allowing the fertile water to pour into the basin. They could then strategically direct this flow through a newly dug network of secondary and tertiary canals, flooding specific, carefully plotted areas of land. This was a complete reversal of the natural process. Instead of a wild, unpredictable marsh, they created an organized mosaic of agricultural basins, much like those in the Nile Valley, but on a far larger and more deliberately engineered scale. They could hold the water in these designated areas for a precise amount of time, allowing the silt to settle and the soil to become thoroughly saturated before draining the excess water back into the lake. This control transformed the lake itself from a salty bog into a vast reservoir, its level carefully managed by the incoming water and the rate of drainage. The result was nothing short of miraculous. Thousands of acres of previously unusable land were brought under cultivation, creating an entirely new and incredibly fertile agricultural province literally from the desert sand. The impact of this project was profound and multifaceted. Economically, it provided a massive and reliable surplus of grain, directly increasing the wealth and stability of the Middle Kingdom state. This new abundance supported a growing population and funded grand architectural projects. Socially, it led to the planned settlement of the region, with new towns and villages springing up to service this new farmland, a government-directed colonization of what was once wilderness. Politically, it was a powerful propaganda tool for the pharaohs, a physical manifestation of their power to enact mad order upon chaos, turning a barren wasteland into a life-giving garden. The Fayum Oasis stands as a stunning case study, a permanent monument to Egyptian hydrological genius that showcases their move from passive adaptation to active, large-scale environmental transformation, proving their survival was built on a foundation of relentless innovation and breathtaking ambition. But the desert's edge was a place of constant negotiation, a fragile boundary between the nourishing order of the Black Land and a wilderness teeming with creatures that symbolized pure, untamed danger. For the ancient Egyptians, the world beyond the irrigated fields was not empty. It was populated by a host of animals that represented immediate physical threats, each one inspiring a potent blend of fear, respect, and fascinating mythological storytelling. The most pervasive of these threats were the scorpions, small, silent, and perfectly camouflaged assassins lurking under stones or in the shadows of mud brick homes. A sting from certain species could bring excruciating pain, paralysis, or even death, especially to a child or someone in poor health. Their danger was amplified by their stealth and their prevalence, making them a constant, low-level anxiety in daily life. This ever-present threat found its ultimate expression in the powerful goddess Serket, the she who tightens the throat, a divine scorpion woman who is both the embodiment of the venom's deadly power and, paradoxically, its most potent cure. Priests and healers who served Serket were experts in antivenoms and magical incantations, and she was invoked as a protector against the very creature she represented, showcasing the Egyptian knack for transforming a source of terror into a source of divine protection. Alongside the scorpion, the silent glide of venomous snakes like the Egyptian cobra and the horned viper inspired a deep and primal fear. A sudden encounter in a field or along a riverbank could be instantly fatal. The cobra, with its iconic hood and raised stance, became one of the most potent symbols in all of Egyptian iconography. Known as the uraeus, the stylized cobra was worn on the brow of the pharaoh, a living weapon poised to spit fire and destroy the enemies of royal authority. This was the ultimate co-opting of a natural threat. The most dangerous creature in the land was harnessed as a symbol of the king's power to protect and to punish. Another great serpent, the monstrous demon Apep, represented chaos itself, a cosmic force of destruction that the sun god Ra had to defeat every single night in his journey through the underworld to ensure the dawn could come. The daily rituals in temples included the symbolic hacking apart of an effigy of Apep, a magical act to ensure the continuity of the universe. Thus, the physical snake in the grass was directly linked to the greatest metaphysical battle between order and chaos, making the avoidance of a snakebite a participation in a divine struggle. Even their life-giving river held a formidable predator, the Nile crocodile. These immense ancient reptiles were the undisputed masters of the riverbanks, capable of snatching a child, a full-grown cow, or an inattentive fisherman with terrifying speed and power. The sight of a crocodile basking on a sandbank was a common yet always chilling reminder of the latent danger that coexisted with the Nile's bounty. Yet once again, the Egyptian response was not simply cowering fear. They observed the crocodile's immense strength, its long lifespan, and its terrifying ferocity, and chose to venerate it. In the form of the god Sobek, the crocodile was worshipped, particularly in the Fayum region, as a deity of raw power, fertility, and military might. Temples housed sacred crocodiles, adorned with gold and jewels, who were fed choice cuts of meat by priests. To appease Sobek was to hopefully secure his protection, to turn his destructive potential away from their communities and toward their enemies. This practice of deification was a sophisticated psychological strategy for managing the unmanageable, a way to richly control the uncontrollable forces of their natural world. Yet this dangerous landscape was also home to creatures that offered not threats, but profound symbolic solutions to life's greatest mysteries. The most famous of these is the humble dung beetle, or scarab. To an outside observer, watching this beetle tirelessly roll a perfect ball of dung across the ground might seem like a lowly, even comical sight, but the ancient Egyptians saw in this behavior a powerful celestial metaphor. They noticed that the scarab emerged its young from within this ball of dung, as if creating life from waste, a miraculous act of spontaneous generation. This connected directly to their most fundamental cosmological belief, the journey of the sun god Ra, who each day rolled the disk of the sun across the sky from east to west, only to be reborn the following morning. The scarab, named Khepri, meaning he who is coming into being, became the physical manifestation of the dawn sun, the god of creation and rebirth. Scarab amulets, carved from stone or molded from faience and inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, were placed over the heart of mummies to ensure a successful rebirth into the afterlife. In the persistent, instinct-driven work of a lowly insect, the Egyptians found a beautiful and reassuring model for the eternal cycle of death and regeneration, transforming an animal of the earth into a symbol of cosmic hope. Far to the west, beyond the fertile ribbon of the Nile and the protective cliffs that bordered it, lay a world that was both a buffer and a constant, simmering threat, the domain of the Libu and other nomadic tribes of the vast western desert. For the ancient Egyptians, this sprawling expanse was not an empty void, but a living, breathing landscape inhabited by people they viewed with a complex mixture of disdain, fear, and grudging necessity. These were the Tehenu and Tejemu, names the Egyptians gave to the various groups we now collectively call Libyans, and their relationship with the riverine civilization was a pendulum that constantly swung between peaceful trade and violent confrontation, a dynamic that would ultimately reshape the very destiny of Egypt. The primary nature of this relationship was one of stark contrast and mutual need. The Egyptians, as settled agriculturalists, saw themselves as the epitome of civilization and order, the people of the Black Land living under the rule of man. In their worldview, the nomadic Libyans were the antithesis of this chaotic forces from the desert, the Red Land. Egyptian art and texts consistently depict them as uncivilized and other, characterized by their distinct appearance, light-colored, ostrich feather headdresses, long braided sidelocks, and tattoos or body paint adorning their skin. They were portrayed as herdsmen, constantly on the move with their flocks of sheep and goats, a lifestyle the stationary Egyptians found baffling and primitive. Yet, this very difference created a powerful economic symbiosis. The Libyans possessed things the Egyptians desired, but could not easily produce themselves live cattle, hides, and perhaps most importantly, the precious red ochre used for pigments and the exotic feathers of the ostrich, which were highly prized for ceremonial fans and adornment. In return, the Libyans sought access to the manufactured wealth of the Nile, grain, beer, honey, and especially the finely crafted metal tools, weapons, and jewelry that were beyond their own technological capabilities. This trade, often conducted through neutral outposts or at the desert's edge, was a fragile but vital link between two utterly different worlds. This fragile balance, however, was perpetually threatened by the harsh realities of the desert climate. The Western Desert was an unpredictable land, and a prolonged period of drought could destabilize the delicate ecology that supported the Libyans' pastoral way of life. When the rains failed and the scant vegetation withered, their herds would begin to die. Faced with starvation, these nomadic tribes had no choice but to look eastward, toward the one place they knew had a guaranteed water supply and vast stores of grain, the Nile Valley. These climatic pressures triggered waves of migration and desperate incursions. Small bands of tribesmen would first attempt to penetrate Egypt's western border, not as an organized army, but as famished refugees seeking pasture for their animals or as raiders looking to seize supplies. The Egyptian state met these intrusions with a network of fortresses and watchposts along the western frontier, collectively known as the Walls of the Ruler. Soldiers stationed in these lonely outposts were the first line of defense, tasked with monitoring caravan routes and repelling these small-scale raids. For centuries, this was the established pattern, a cycle of tension and skirmish along a contested border. There were moments, however, when this pressure escalated from troublesome raids into a full-blown existential crisis. The most famous of these occurred during the reign of the great pharaoh Merneptah in the 13th century BCE, and again later under Ramesses III in the 12th century BCE. This was no longer a matter of a few desperate families. It was a mass, coordinated migration of entire tribes, a veritable tidal wave of humanity and livestock spilling out of the desert. The Libyans had now allied with the coalition of seafaring raiders known as the Sea Peoples, creating a terrifying pincer movement that threatened to crush Egypt from both the west and the north. Pharaoh Merneptah recorded his great victory against this combined force on his famous Israel stele, boasting of slaying thousands and taking countless captives. Decades later, Ramesses III faced an even larger invasion, which he depicted in stunning detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. These reliefs show chaotic battles, with Egyptian chariots and infantry cutting down Libyan warriors with their distinctive feathers and sidelocks, while their families and cattle trains wait helplessly in the background. These were not mere border scuffles. They were desperate struggles for the survival of the Egyptian state itself, fought against an enemy driven by the relentless hunger of their barren homeland. The ultimate irony, and perhaps the greatest testament to the complexity of this relationship, is that the very people the Egyptians fought so hard to keep out would eventually come to rule them. After the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt entered a period of political fragmentation and weakness known as the Third Intermediate Period. The central authority of the pharaohs crumbled, and the state fractured into smaller, competing domains. Into this power vacuum stepped the descendants of those Libyan tribesmen who had, over generations, not been repelled but gradually absorbed. Many previous pharaohs, following a victory, had adopted a policy of integrating their captured enemies. Thousands of Libyan prisoners of war were settled on granted lands in the Delta region, forced to serve as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Over time, these communities grew in size, wealth, and influence, maintaining their distinct tribal identities and chiefly lineages while becoming increasingly Egyptianized. They rose through the military ranks, eventually commanding entire divisions. Then, in the north, a powerful dynasty of Libyan chieftains from the city of Bubastes seized the throne. These were the pharaohs of the 22nd dynasty, most notably Sheshonq I, who is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as Shishak. He and his successors ruled a divided Egypt, their rule a bizarre fusion of pharaonic tradition and Libyan tribal customs, proving that the once despised desert nomads could not only breach the walls of the ruler, but could eventually come to sit upon the Horus throne itself, their ostrich feathers becoming a symbol not of chaos, but of a new, unexpected chapter in the long, resilient story. The Nile. Yet, even as the Libyans from the west pushed at their borders, the Egyptians were masters of extracting miracles from the very desert that seemed to threaten them. And perhaps no substance better exemplifies this mastery than natron, a stark white mineral that became one of the most crucial materials in their entire world, a true gift of the desert that served them from the moment of birth until long after death. This wasn't a single chemical compound, but a natural mixture of salts, primarily sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, that collected in crusty, crystalline deposits on the shores of certain desert lakes, most famously in the Wadi Natron northwest of Memphis. To the Egyptian mind, this substance was sacred, imbued with a potent, purifying power that made it essential for maintaining both physical and spiritual cleanliness in a world where the two were inextricably linked. In their daily lives, natron was the ancient equivalent of a multi-purpose cleaning agent, a desert-derived wonder that tackled a surprising variety of household tasks. Its mild abrasive quality and natural ability to break down grease and dirt made it a powerful cleansing soap. People would mix the crushed powder with oil to create a primitive yet effective paste for washing their bodies and their clothes, cutting through the grime of daily life under a desert sun. Its properties extended into the kitchen, where it was used as a cleaning agent for pots and dishes, and even into the realm of medicine, where it was sometimes applied as an antiseptic for wounds or taken internally to soothe digestive ailments. But its most fascinating domestic use was in the kitchen, where it acted as a primitive form of chemical leavening. When added to dough, the sodium bicarbonate in natron would react, producing tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide that would cause the bread to rise slightly, creating a lighter, less dense loaf. This humble mineral, then, was present at the family table, in the laundry, and in the medicine chest, a versatile tool that helped maintain the order and purity of everyday existence. However, it was in the sacred, meticulous process of mummification that natron achieved its ultimate and most famous purpose. The Egyptians believed that for the soul to live eternally in the afterlife, the physical body of the deceased had to be preserved as a permanent, recognizable vessel. Decay was the enemy of eternity, the ultimate chaos that represented a final death. Their brilliant solution to this problem was not to fight nature, but to harness it in its most extreme form using the desiccating power of the desert itself, concentrated and refined into natron. This mineral was the key to artificially replicating the perfect natural mummification that occurred when a body was buried in the hot, dry sand, but with far greater control and much better results. The process was a meticulous 70-day ritual, and the use of natron was its central phase. After the embalmers had removed the internal organs through a small incision and processed them separately, the empty body cavity was thoroughly cleansed with palm wine and aromatic spices to kill bacteria and eliminate odor. Then, the real work of preservation began. The body was completely covered, inside and out, with hundreds of pounds of dry natron salts. It wasn't simply dumped on, it was carefully packed into every orifice and cavity, ensuring that the desiccation would be total and uniform. The body was then left to rest on a slanted bed, allowing any fluids that were drawn out by the salts to drain away, preventing any moisture from lingering and causing rot. For 40 days, the natron performed its silent, miraculous work. It didn't pickle the body as previously thought. Instead, it acted as a supremely effective desiccant, pulling all the moisture, which makes up about 75% of the human body, out through the skin and tissue. The fats and lipids within the body saponified, essentially turning into a kind of soap that further aided in preservation. This slow, thorough drying process did not cook or burn the tissues. It gently and completely dehydrated them, leaving the skin, muscles, and bones leathery, brittle, but perfectly recognizable and free from the bacteria that cause decay. After this 40-day period, the now desiccated body was uncovered. The hardened natron was removed, and the rigid, shrunken form was then washed and anointed with precious oils and resin. This final anointing restored some plasticity to the skin, making the body pliable enough for the next sacred stages. The meticulous wrapping in hundreds of yards of linen strips and the placement of protective amulets, finally preparing the eternal vessel for its journey into the afterlife. In this profound ritual, the desert's gift of natron became the very bridge between the temporal world and eternity. While the deep desert provided gold and stone, the lifeblood of Egyptian administration and culture flowed from a much greener source, the lush, watery marshes of the Nile Delta. Here, in the shallow, sun-drenched waters, grew a plant that would become one of the most versatile and transformative resources of the ancient world, papyrus. This towering reed, with its strong triangular stem and fluffy green crown, was far more than just a feature of the landscape. It was a botanical marvel that the Egyptians harnessed for everything from basic subsistence to the very preservation of their knowledge, proving that survival depended as much on the marsh as it did on the desert. The process of harvesting and utilizing papyrus was a refined art, beginning with skilled harvesters wading into the dense thickets, known as papyrus swamps. They would carefully cut the mature stems, which could grow as tall as a man, close to the base using sickles or sharp knives. These harvested stems were then processed with incredible ingenuity for a multitude of purposes. For everyday items, the tough, fibrous outer rind was stripped away and could be twisted into strong, durable ropes, or woven into mats, baskets, and even sandals. The buoyant, pithy interior of the stem was bundled together to create the cores of lightweight, nimble boats, perfect for navigating the delta's maze of waterways for hunting and fishing. This practical use of the entire plant meant that nearly every part of the papyrus was put to work, supporting daily life in countless tangible ways. Yet, the most revolutionary application of papyrus was undoubtedly its transformation into a writing surface, the world's first and most effective paper. The creation of a papyrus sheet was a complex, multi-step process that resembled a form of alchemy. Artisans would take the pithy core of the fresh stem and slice it into thin, narrow strips. These strips were then laid out side by side, slightly overlapping, on a hard, absorbent surface. A second layer of strips was placed on top, perpendicular to the first, creating a crosshatch pattern. This sheet was then pounded with a mallet, which mashed the layers together and forced out the plant's natural starches and sugars, acting as a powerful adhesive. After pressing and drying under weights, the result was a smooth, flexible, and incredibly durable sheet with a faint grid-like pattern. By polishing the surface with a smooth stone or shell, scribes created a perfect pale cream-colored canvas ready for writing. This invention of papyrus paper, or papyrus as the Greeks later called it, was nothing short of a technological revolution. It was exponentially lighter, more compact, and easier to transport and store than clay tablets or heavy stone slabs. For the first time in history, a civilization could efficiently manage a complex bureaucracy. Scribes could now keep detailed records of grain harvests, tax collections, census data, and legal decrees on scrolls that could be easily stored in archives and transported across the kingdom. This efficient record-keeping was the absolute backbone of the Egyptian state, enabling the precise planning and logistics required to build the pyramids, feed a nation, and maintain a standing army. Without the administrative power granted by papyrus, the pharaoh's control over such a vast and organized kingdom would have been impossible. Beyond its bureaucratic function, papyrus became the sacred vessel for Egyptian culture and thought. It was on these scrolls that scribes meticulously copied religious texts like the Book of the Dead, filled with spells to guide the soul through the underworld. They recorded medical treatises, mathematical problems, literary tales like the story of Sinu, and poetry. Each scroll was a snapshot of a living, breathing culture, a direct line to the minds of people who lived thousands of years ago. The relative permanence of ink on papyrus, especially when stored in the dry desert air of Egyptian tombs, is the primary reason we know so much about their world today. The humble papyrus plant, born from the marshy fringes of their civilization, gifted humanity with the very medium that allowed knowledge to be recorded, preserved, and passed down through the ages, making it one of ancient Egypt's most profound and enduring contributions to the world. What emerges from the sands of time is not merely a story of survival, but a masterclass in holistic adaptation, a blueprint for resilience written by the ancients that still holds profound wisdom for us today. The true genius of the Egyptians was not in one single miraculous invention, but in their interconnected system of living, a philosophy where water management, adaptive agriculture, ruthless resourcefulness, and far-reaching trade were not separate strategies but threads in a single, unbreakable rope. They understood that to thrive in an arid world, you must see the entire environment as a partner, a system of give and take where every challenge conceals an opportunity waiting to be unlocked. Their mastery began with the fundamental truth: in the desert, water is life, but it is also time. The Egyptians didn't just use water, they mastered its timing. They learned the rhythm of the Nile's flood not to resist it, but to dance with it, constructing vast networks of basins and canals to extend the river's fertile embrace for as long as possible. This was slow water management, capturing the flood, spreading it, and allowing it to percolate into the earth, recharging aquifers and nurturing the soil for months. Beyond the river, they became hunters of hidden moisture, digging deep wells into the wadis and carving cisterns into rock to capture fleeting rains. This ancient wisdom stands in stark contrast to our modern, energy-intensive approach of moving water vast distances over mountains and desert. Today, cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix are finally learning the Egyptian lesson, albeit with advanced technology, by investing in massive wastewater reclamation and aggressive aquifer recharge programs, recognizing that the key to resilience in the 21st century is not just finding new water, but managing the water we have with the meticulous, time-conscious care of an ancient irrigation. Priests, their agricultural practices were a testament to the power of working with nature's constraints rather than against them. They didn't waste precious water and soil trying to grow crops that were ill-suited to the climate. Instead, they cultivated a limited but powerful palette of superbly adapted staples: emmer wheat and barley for calories and beer, flax for linen, and a suite of hardy vegetables like onions and lentils. They understood crop selection as a form of climate adaptation, choosing plants that thrived in the heat and could mature within the narrow window of moisture provided by the receding flood. This principle of local adaptation is at the very heart of the modern movement towards regenerative agriculture and and food sovereignty. From the dry lands of Australia to the American Southwest, farmers are now looking back to these ancient methods, reviving drought-tolerant heritage grains and practicing water harvesting techniques that mimic the natural flow of water across a landscape, understanding that food security in a warming world depends on growing what belongs there. Perhaps their most powerful legacy was a mindset of radical resourcefulness, a belief that everything had a purpose and nothing needed to be wasted. They looked at the barren desert cliffs and saw not emptiness, but vast quarries of limestone, sandstone, and granite. They saw the papyrus marsh and transformed a simple reed into paper, boats, and rope. They foraged the desert fringes for honey, medicinal plants, and game, diversifying their diet and reducing their reliance on a single food source. This circular economy, where waste was minimized and every output became an input for another process, is a lesson we are urgently relearning today. The concepts of cradle-to-cradle design and the zero waste movement are modern echoes of the ancient Egyptian ethos. Their ability to see value in what others would overlook, turning silt into bricks, natron into a preservative, and donkey caravans into a logistics network, teaches us that innovation is not always about creating something new, but about perceiving the hidden potential in the resources that already surround us. Finally, their survival was underpinned by connection, not isolation. They understood that no oasis, no matter how lush, could truly prosper alone. The great desert highways and the vital trade that flowed along them connected the isolated Nile Valley to a world of resources, from the gold of Nubia to the turquoise of Sinai and the exotic goods of the African interior. This trade was their insurance policy against local drought and crop failure, a way of distributing risk across a vast network. In our globally interconnected world, this lesson is more complex but equally critical. While global supply chains provide a buffer, the ancient model points us towards building resilient regional networks, localizing production of essential goods, while maintaining diverse trade partnerships for everything else. It's about building a system where communities are self-reliant in core necessities, but interconnected for mutual support, creating a web of resilience that can withstand the shocks that inevitably come. The enduring lesson from the ancient Egyptians is not a specific technology, but a way of thinking. It is a worldview rooted in deep observation, patience, and a symbiotic relationship with a demanding environment. They teach us that resilience is not a battle for control, but a continuous process of adaptation, a dance with the natural world where humility and ingenuity are the most valuable partners. As we face our own era of climate uncertainty and resource constraints, their 5,000-year-old legacy offers a powerful, hopeful message that by listening to the land, valuing what it provides, and connecting with each other, humanity can not only survive, but can build civilizations of breathtaking beauty and endurance that leave a mark on history long after they are gone. So we've journeyed together across the sands of time, witnessing one of humanity's most profound stories of resilience. The ancient Egyptians stared into the face of an unforgiving desert, and instead of seeing a barrier, they saw a blueprint. They looked at a river that flooded and receded and saw not chaos, but a clockwork rhythm to build a civilization upon. They transformed silt into fertile fields, papyrus reeds into the very paper of history, and desert minerals into agents of eternal preservation. Theirs was a holistic genius, a seamless fusion of water management, agricultural wisdom, architectural brilliance, and spiritual insight that turned a landscape of scarcity into a cradle of enduring abundance. They didn't just survive the Sahara, they conversed with it, learned its secrets, and partnered with it to create a legacy that has captivated the world for millennia. This story is far more than a chapter in a history book. It's a timeless lesson in human potential. It challenges us to look at our own environment with all its modern complexities and looming challenges and ask ourselves a fundamental question: what can we learn from their resilience today? In an era of climate uncertainty and resource constraints, their example shines brighter than ever. They teach us that sustainability isn't about flashy, futuristic technology alone, but about deep observation, patience, and working in harmony with the natural systems already in place. It's about valuing water as the sacred currency of life, diversifying our resources, building for the climate we have, and fostering a culture of ingenuity that sees potential where others only see problems. I'd love to hear which part of their incredible story resonated most with you. Was it the clever simplicity of basin irrigation, the way they turned nature into a tool for eternity, or the daring desert scouts, the Medjay, who mastered the wasteland? Let me know in the comments below what you found to be the most surprising or ingenious survival tactic. I read every single one. If you enjoyed unraveling this ancient mystery with me, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. There are countless more mysteries waiting to be explored.